Everyone mocked the silent ranch girl, until she faced down a gunman without blinking. Nobody in Millbrook thought much of Sarah Mae Thompson. She was just a quiet girl who swept the general store floors, kept her eyes down, and never spoke unless spoken to. The townsfolk whispered behind her back, calling her strange, simple-minded, maybe even touched in the head. But on that scorching July afternoon in 1876, when death rode into town with spurs jangling and a Colt 45 gleaming in the desert sun, Sarah Mae would prove that sometimes the quietest waters run the deepest. The morning started like any other in the dusty cattle town of Millbrook, Arizona Territory. The sun climbed over the red mesa like a burning coin, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined Main Street. Sarah Mae was already at work in Henderson's general store, her worn brown dress disappearing behind tall shelves stocked with flour sacks and canned peaches. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her calloused hands moved efficiently as she organized merchandise that had arrived on yesterday's supply wagon. "That girl gives me the shivers," whispered Mrs. Abernathy to her friend as they browsed the fabric section. "Been here 2 years now, and I ain't heard her string together more than 5 words at a time." "Heard she came from back east after some kind of tragedy," replied Mrs. Caldwell, lowering her voice. "Poor thing probably ain't right in the head. War does terrible things to families." Sarah Mae heard every word, but she kept working, dusting jars of preserves with steady hands. She'd grown used to the whispers, the sideways glances, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was far more complicated than their small-town gossip could imagine. At precisely noon, the brass bell above the store's entrance chimed, and Sheriff Thomas Wyatt stepped inside, his badge catching the light that streamed through the front windows. He was a good man, fair and honest, with graying temples and kind eyes that had seen too much violence in his 43 years of life. "Afternoon, Sarah Mae," he said warmly, tipping his hat. "How's business today?" "Good afternoon, Sheriff," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Henderson is at the bank. Can I help you with something?" Before Sheriff Wyatt could answer, the sound of galloping horses thundered down Main Street, followed by shouting and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. The sheriff's hand instinctively moved to his holster as he rushed to the window, and Sarah Mae felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "Stay inside and lock the door behind me," Sheriff Wyatt commanded, but Sarah Mae was already moving toward the back of the store, toward the small room where Henderson kept his hunting rifles and ammunition. Her fingers, no longer trembling, found the Winchester lever-action rifle that hung on the wall behind a stack of horse blankets. Outside, chaos erupted like a prairie wildfire. "This is Jake Morrison," a gravelly voice boomed across the town square. "I want every soul in this godforsaken place to listen real careful. I'm here for Sheriff Wyatt, and I ain't leaving until I get satisfaction for what he done to my brother." Sarah Mae peered to the store's back window and saw him clearly for the first time. Jake Morrison sat tall in his saddle, a mountain of a man with wild black hair and a face marked by years of hard living. His gang of 4 riders spread out behind him, each one armed and dangerous, their horses stamping impatiently in the dust. Morrison's reputation preceded him throughout the territory, a cold-blooded killer who'd escaped from Yuma Territorial Prison 3 months earlier, leaving 2 guards dead in his wake. "Tom Wyatt," Morrison shouted again, his voice echoing off the adobe buildings. "You killed my baby brother Danny in a fair fight, but I don't care about fair. Come out here and face me, or I start shooting innocent folks until you do." Through the front window, Sarah Mae could see Sheriff Wyatt standing alone in the middle of Main Street, his hand hovering near his gun. The townspeople had scattered like tumbleweeds in a windstorm, diving behind water troughs, ducking into doorways, pulling their children close. The sheriff looked calm, but Sarah Mae could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set. He was outnumbered 5-1, and everyone knew it. "Jake Morrison," Sheriff Wyatt called out, his voice steady and strong. "Your brother drew on me first, and there were witnesses. He was robbing the bank, and he chose his path. Don't make the same mistake he did." Morrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Mistake? The only mistake was leaving you breathing, Sheriff. But I'm gonna fix that right now." The outlaw's hand moved toward his gun, and time seemed to slow down like honey in winter. Sarah May watched from the shadows of the general store, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what was about to happen. She'd seen it before, in another town, another life, when she was someone else entirely. But then something unexpected happened. Sheriff Wyatt didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he took a step forward, his hands raised peacefully. "Hold on, Morrison," he said. "You want justice for your brother? Fine. But not here, not with innocent people around. Let's ride out to Dead Man's Canyon, just you and me. Winner takes all." Morrison spat into the dust, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'm some kind of fool, Sheriff? Soon as we get out there, you'll have deputies waiting in ambush." "No ambush," Wyatt replied. "Just two men settling things the old way. But if you're too yellow to face me alone..." The insult hit its mark. Morrison's face flushed red with anger, and his hand moved to his gun grip. "Yellow? You calling me yellow?" That's when Sarah May made her decision. She couldn't watch another good man die while she hid in the shadows. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. Not again. The front door of Henderson's General Store opened with a soft creak, and Sarah May Thompson stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun. She moved with purpose, the Winchester rifle held loosely in her hands, not threatening but ready. Her footsteps were silent on the wooden boardwalk as she walked toward the confrontation, and for the first time in 2 years, her voice rang out clear and strong across the town square. "That's enough, Jake Morrison." Every head turned. Every eye stared. The quiet, simple-minded store girl was standing between a notorious outlaw and the sheriff, and she didn't look scared at all. In fact, she looked dangerous. Morrison's horse sidled nervously as he stared down at the young woman, who'd appeared like a ghost from the general store. Well, well, what do we have here? The little mouse wants to play with the big cats." "I said that's enough," Sarah May repeated, her voice carrying an authority that made several of Morrison's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "You have a grievance with Sheriff Wyatt, but this isn't the way to settle it." "And who might you be to tell me what to do, girl?" Morrison's voice dripped with contempt, but Sarah May caught something else in his eyes, uncertainty. "My name is Sarah May Thompson," she said, stepping closer. "But 2 years ago, in a town called Cedar Ridge, Colorado, folks knew me by a different name. They called me Deputy Marshal Sarah Thompson." The words hit the dusty street like a thunderclap. Sheriff Wyatt's eyes widened in recognition and understanding. Mrs. Abernathy gasped from her hiding place behind the water trough. Even Morrison's gang members exchanged worried glances. "That's right," Sarah May continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was a federal marshal for 6 years before I came here. I've tracked down men like you across 3 territories. I've faced down outlaws who make you look like a church choir boy. And I've never, not once, backed down from a fight when innocent people were in danger." Morrison's hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw. Something in the young woman's eyes told him that would be a fatal mistake. "You're lying," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just some scared little store clerk trying to play hero." Sarah May smiled then, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Am I? Tell me, Morrison, have you ever heard of the Cedar Ridge Massacre? When the Dalton gang tried to rob the bank and kill half the town?" Morrison's face went pale. Every outlaw in the territory knew that story. 7 hardened criminals had ridden into Cedar Ridge on a quiet Thursday morning, planning to rob the bank and disappear into the mountains. Instead, they'd run into a deputy marshal who tracked them for 3 weeks through some of the worst country in Colorado. When the smoke cleared, 4 outlaws were dead, 2 were wounded and captured, and 1 had escaped with a bullet in his shoulder. The deputy marshal had saved 17 innocent lives that day. "That was you," Morrison whispered. "That was me," Sarah May confirmed. "And if you think I'm going to let you hurt these people, you're dead wrong." The silence stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Sheriff Wyatt had backed away slowly, giving Sarah May room to work, but his hand remained near his gun. The townspeople watched from their hiding places, hardly daring to breathe. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, stamping and snorting nervously. Morrison's gang was getting restless. "Boss," one of them called out. "Maybe we should just ride out of here. This don't feel right." "Shut up, Charlie," Morrison growled, but Sarah May could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. He was a killer, but he wasn't stupid. The story of Cedar Ridge was legendary among outlaws, and the marshal who'd single-handedly taken down the Dalton gang was spoken of in whispers around campfires from New Mexico to Montana. "I'll make you a deal, Morrison," Sarah May said, taking another step forward. The Winchester was still in her hands, but she held it casually, without apparent threat. "You and your boys ride out of here right now, and I'll give you a 5-minute head start before I come after you. Stay, and I promise you won't live to see another sunset." "You're bluffing," Morrison said, but his voice cracked slightly. Sarah May's eyes hardened. "Try me." For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the buildings and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then Morrison cursed under his breath and yanked his horse's reins. "This ain't over, Wyatt," he called to the sheriff. "But it ain't worth dying over a piece of nothing town like this one." He wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the edge of town, his gang following close behind. Within minutes, they were nothing but dust clouds disappearing into the desert heat. Sarah May stood in the middle of Main Street, watching them go, until she was certain they wouldn't be coming back. Only then did she lower the rifle and turn to face the townspeople who were slowly emerging from their hiding places. Sheriff Wyatt was the first to approach her, his expression a mixture of awe and respect. "Deputy Marshal Thompson," he said formally, tipping his hat. "I'm honored to make your acquaintance." "Former Deputy Marshal," Sarah May corrected quietly. "I retired from that life 2 years ago." "Why?" Sheriff Wyatt asked gently. "Why give up a career like that to sweep floors in a general store?" Sarah May was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands. When she spoke, her voice was soft again, vulnerable. "Because I got tired of killing people, Sheriff. Even when they deserved it. Even when it was necessary. After Cedar Ridge, after all those years of violence and death, I just wanted to find somewhere peaceful. Somewhere I could be invisible and not have to draw my gun ever again." Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward then, tears in her eyes. "Oh, child," she said, reaching out to touch Sarah May's arm. "We've been so wrong about you. So terribly wrong." "No, ma'am," Sarah May replied with a sad smile. "You saw exactly what I wanted you to see. A quiet, simple girl who wouldn't cause any trouble. Someone who could disappear into the background and never have to face violence again." Mr. Henderson, the store owner, pushed through the growing crowd, his face flushed with excitement and gratitude. "Sarah May, you saved this whole town. Morrison would have killed half of us looking for Sheriff Wyatt." "Maybe," Sarah May said. "Or maybe Sheriff Wyatt would have handled it just fine on his own. He's a good lawman." Sheriff Wyatt shook his head. 5 against 1. I wouldn't have stood a chance, and we both know it. You saved my life today, Marshal Thompson." "Sarah May," she corrected. "Just Sarah May. The marshal died in Cedar Ridge 2 years ago." But as she looked around at the faces of the townspeople, faces that now showed respect instead of pity, understanding instead of whispered gossip, Sarah May realized that maybe the marshal hadn't died after all. Maybe she'd just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. Over the following weeks, word of what had happened in Millbrook spread throughout the territory like wildfire. The story grew with each telling, as stories do, until it became legend. The quiet store girl who'd faced down Jake Morrison and his gang without flinching. The former federal marshal who'd given up her badge for a broom, only to take up arms again when her adopted town needed her. Sarah May tried to go back to her quiet life, but it wasn't the same. People nodded to her respectfully on the street. Children stared at her with wide, admiring eyes. Sheriff Wyatt stopped by the store every day, not to buy anything, but just to talk to someone who understood the weight of wearing a badge and carrying a gun. "You know," he said one evening as Sarah May was closing up the store, "I could use a deputy. Someone with experience. Someone the outlaws would think twice about crossing." Sarah May looked up from sweeping the floor, studying his weathered face in the lamplight. "I told you, Sheriff. I'm done with that life." "Are you?" he asked gently. "Because from where I'm standing, It looks like that life isn't done with you." She paused in her sweeping, considering his words. Through the front window, she could see Main Street settling into evening quiet. Lanterns were being lit in windows. Families were gathering for supper. Children were being called in from their games. It was the peaceful life she dreamed of during all those years of tracking killers through dangerous country. But she also remembered the look in Mrs. Abernathy's eyes when Morrison's gang had thundered into town. The fear of the children hiding behind their mother's skirts. The knowledge that good people were about to die while she hid in the shadows. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Sheriff Wyatt smiled and tipped his hat. "That's all I can ask for, Sarah May. Good night." After he left, Sarah May finished cleaning the store and made her way to the small room in the back where she'd been living since arriving in Millbrook. But instead of going to bed, she sat by the window and looked out at the stars that filled the desert sky like scattered diamonds. She thought about the woman she'd been before Cedar Ridge, confident, determined, unafraid. She thought about the woman she tried to become afterward, invisible, silent, safe. And she thought about the woman she might be now, someone who could find a balance between peace and purpose, between hiding from violence and standing up to it when necessary. The next morning, Jake Morrison was found dead 50 miles outside of town, shot down by bounty hunters who'd been tracking him for weeks. His gang scattered to the four winds, never to trouble Millbrook again. When Sheriff Wyatt brought Sarah May the news, she simply nodded and went back to stocking shelves. But that afternoon, she surprised him by walking into his office with a cup of coffee and a question. "That deputy position," she said, "does it come with a decent salary?" Sheriff Wyatt grinned. "Decent enough. Plus a badge and all the respect that comes with it." Sarah May smiled back, and for the first time in 2 years, it reached her eyes. "Well then, Sheriff Wyatt, I believe you've got yourself a deputy." The formal swearing-in ceremony took place the following Sunday after church, with most of the town gathered in the square to watch. Sarah May raised her right hand and repeated the oath that she'd spoken once before, in another life, in another place. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't running toward violence or away from it. She was simply standing her ground, ready to protect the people and the peaceful life she'd found in Millbrook. As Sheriff Wyatt pinned the deputy's badge to her vest, Mrs. Abernathy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I never thought I'd see the day," she whispered to Mrs. Caldwell. "Our quiet little Sarah May, wearing a badge." "Quiet waters run deep," Mrs. Caldwell replied wisely. "My grandmother always said that. We should have known there was more to that girl than met the eye." And so Sarah May Thompson became Deputy Thompson once again, but on her own terms this time. She kept her room behind the general store, helping Mr. Henderson during the day and patrolling the town at night. She was still quiet, still thoughtful, but the fear was gone. The shame was gone. She'd found a way to be both the woman who wanted peace and the woman who would fight for it when necessary. Years later, when traveling writers came through Millbrook collecting stories of the Old West, they always heard about the day the silent ranch girl faced down Jake Morrison and his gang. The story grew with each telling, as stories do, but the heart of it remained true. Sometimes the bravest people are the ones who choose their battles carefully. Sometimes the strongest voices belong to those who speak only when they have something important to say. And sometimes, the most dangerous opponent is the one nobody sees coming until it's too late. Sarah May Thompson had learned that lesson the hard way in Cedar Ridge. Jake Morrison learned it the easy way in Millbrook, when a quiet store girl with steady hands and steel in her spine stepped out of the shadows and into the blazing desert sun, ready to do whatever it took to protect the innocent. The townspeople of Millbrook never again whispered that Sarah May was simple or strange. They knew better now. They'd seen what happened when you underestimated the quiet ones, when you mistook silence for weakness, when you forgot that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the gun in someone's holster, it's the courage in their heart. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, about the brave men and women who tamed the Wild West with nothing but grit and determination, you know where to find them.